This is a school, not a charity. Who gave you permission to feed him? The principal's voice cut sharply across the playground. Leo Moore, the quiet janitor, stood by the bench, hands gently clutching the brown paper bag. He didn't speak. He just lowered his head as security escorted him away. Children watched in silence, confused as the man they loved was led off campus. That afternoon, the bench sat empty, a quiet reminder of his kindness. By Monday, the school parking lot was filled not with parents but with black military SUVs. Marines in full dress uniform, stepped out medals gleaming in the sun. Who were they here for? And why was an entire platoon about to salute the janitor the school had cast aside, Leonard Leo Moore? 69 was the kind of man most people overlooked, and that was just fine by him. A retired Army logistics officer, Leo had seen more than his share of chaos, hardship, and loss during his years of service. He had marched through sandstorms, coordinated supplies under fire, and watched young soldiers go home with metal scars, or worse, not go home at all. When he left the military, Leo didn't crave medals or parades. He craved peace. That peace, oddly enough, came in the form of a mop and a set of school keys at Willow Creek Elementary. For the past 7 years, Leo had worked as a school custodian, sweeping hallways, patching up broken lockers, fixing leaky faucets, and wiping sticky handprints from the walls. The staff saw him as dependable. The parents saw him as invisible. But to the children, Leo was a quiet legend. The kids called him Uncle Leo. They knew he always carried a small stash of peppermints in his pocket for anyone who had a rough day. He was the one who tied stray shoelaces, found missing mittens, and taped up favorite picture books that were falling apart. Leo didn't just keep the floors clean. He kept the spirit of the school a little brighter. At home, his Army medals sat tucked away in a drawer. He never talked about his past, never hung a single photo on his walls, never wore a cap that marked him as a veteran. Leo didn't feel the need to remind anyone of who he'd been. To him, his real mission now was simple: keep the school running smoothly and be a quiet, steady presence for the children who needed it. And Leo had a soft spot for certain kids, the ones who came to school in worn-out shoes or who waited a little too long at the end of the day for a parent to show up. He noticed the ones who hung back, watching the other kids share snacks or unpack neatly made lunches while they sat quietly with an empty lunchbox. Leo understood that kind of hunger, not just the hunger for food, but the hunger for attention, for comfort, for someone to notice. Maybe that's why, when he saw 11-year-old Sam Turner sitting alone on the playground, it tugged at something deep inside him. Leo knew what it meant to be overlooked, and sometimes he believed the smallest acts of kindness made the biggest difference. Sammy, or Sam Turner, was one of those kids who slipped easily into the corners of a room. 11 years old, slight and wiry, with deep brown eyes that saw everything but rarely gave anything away. He was the kind of child people might describe as quiet or shy, though anyone paying closer attention would have sensed something deeper, a kind of watchfulness that came from carrying more than his fair share of burdens for someone his age. 2 years earlier, Sam's world had shifted overnight. His father, Staff Sergeant Mark Turner, had been killed in Afghanistan while protecting his unit from an ambush. The folded flag the Marines had delivered now sat on a shelf in his bedroom, and life for Sam and his mother, Emily, was never the same. Emily worked 2 jobs, pulling double shifts as a night nurse and filling in as a grocery clerk during the day. She was exhausted, and though she did her best, sometimes things fell through the cracks like packed lunches. One chilly morning in October, Leo noticed Sam sitting alone on the edge of the playground during lunch. His backpack next to him, a small plastic cup of water, his only companion around him. The other kids tore into peanut butter sandwiches, pizza slices, juice boxes, and Lunchables. Their laughter echoing across the playground. Sam sat quietly watching, but never joining. Leo walked by, mop handle over his shoulder, the ever-present peppermints rattling in his pocket. He slowed, crouching slightly beside the boy. "Everything okay, buddy?" Leo asked softly, the way you speak to a bird you don't want to startle. Sam gave a small shrug, eyes fixed on the ground. "Yeah, just not hungry," he mumbled. Leo had seen that look before: the tight jaw, the lowered eyes, the quiet deflection, pride trying to hide need. It was a look he'd seen in war zones, in soldiers too stubborn to ask for help, and in local children trying to salvage their dignity. Leo gave a small nod, not pressing the boy further, but as he stood and walked away, the weight of it settled into his chest like a stone. That night, standing in his modest kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound, Leo reached for a loaf of bread and made an extra sandwich. He wrapped it carefully in wax paper, added an apple and a small carton of milk. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes Leo knew something was all a person needed to remember they weren't invisible. From that first sandwich, a quiet routine blossomed between Leo and Sam. One neither of them spoke of, but both came to depend on. Every morning before the bell rang, Leo would slip a small brown paper bag onto the bench near the playground, right where Sam always sat. Inside was a simple meal, a sandwich, usually turkey or peanut butter and jelly, an apple or banana, and a juice box. Leo never drew attention to it. He never pointed it out to Sam, never waited around to see the boy's reaction. He simply placed it down, adjusted his mop handle on his shoulder, and carried on with his day. And Sam, for his part, never said a word either. But slowly the change began to show. Sam's hunched shoulders began to lift, his face less drawn, his steps less heavy. One afternoon, as Leo swept the hallway outside the classrooms, he caught sight of Sam on the playground, not sitting alone on the bench this time, but kicking a soccer ball around with two other boys. His laugh rang out across the grass, clear and bright. Leo paused just a moment, a soft smile on his face before turning back to his work. As the days passed, Leo began adding little notes to the bags. They weren't long, just a few lines scribbled on scraps of paper. Sometimes a funny army joke, sometimes a fact about far-off places Leo had seen during his service. Did you know camels can drink 30 gallons of water at once? One note read. Another said, "Be brave today, Sam. You're stronger than you know." Some mornings Leo left a small drawing, a goofy doodle of a tank wearing sunglasses or a smiling sun with stick arms. For Leo, it was a small act, but for Sam, it was a quiet lifeline. What made the routine even more special was its secrecy. Leo never tried to take credit, never asked Sam for thanks. He understood something many adults forgot, that sometimes the greatest kindness is the one done without expecting anything in return. For Sam, those small gestures meant the world. He began to look forward to lunchtime, not just for the meal, but for the quiet reassurance that someone saw him, someone cared. And while neither spoke of it, the bond between them grew stronger, woven together by turkey sandwiches, juice boxes, and handwritten notes that reminded a boy who had lost so much that he was never truly alone. But kindness, as quiet as it tries to be, has a way of drawing attention. For weeks, Leo's simple act went unnoticed until the wrong eyes finally saw it. Principal Carol Simmons was a woman of order, routine, and above all, policy. With perfectly styled hair, sharp suits, and a clipboard never far from her side, she ran Willow Creek Elementary like a ship's captain steering through stormy seas. To her, rules weren't just guidelines, they were the glue that held the school together. One Friday afternoon, as Leo placed the familiar brown bag on Sam's bench and turned away, fate intervened. Carol Simmons, crossing the playground on her way to a meeting, spotted Sam eagerly tearing into the sandwich, the handwritten note fluttering in his lap. Her heels clicked across the pavement with the finality of a gavel. "Where did this come from? Who gave you this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unforgiving. Sam froze mid-bite, eyes wide. Around him, the playground fell still. From across the yard, Leo saw the commotion. Without hesitation, he approached, mop handle resting against his shoulder like an old soldier's cane. "It was me, ma'am," Leo said softly, his voice calm but unwavering. The principal turned on him, her face tightening. "Did you have authorization? Do you realize this violates health regulations? School policy clearly prohibits distributing outside food to students." "What if he had allergies? What if his parents sue us?" Leo listened quietly. He understood her words, but in his mind they collided with another truth, the one he'd learned in places far more chaotic than an elementary school. Sometimes compassion mattered more than procedure. Within the hour, the wheels of bureaucracy turned swiftly. Leo was called to the office, handed termination papers, and told to pack his belongings. There was no hearing, no conversation, no leniency. Rules were rules. As he gathered his things from the small custodian's closet, the place that had been his corner of peace for 7 years, Leo moved slowly, deliberately folding his uniform and tucking his few personal items into a small bag. Outside, the children gathered at the classroom windows, their faces pressed against the glass. They watched in silence as the man who had fixed their leaky sinks found their missing toys and made them laugh when they scraped their knees, walked toward the front doors. Leo paused there for a moment, glancing back. He raised one hand in a small, gentle wave. There was no anger in his expression, just a quiet sadness. Then, with shoulders still straight from years of military bearing, Leo stepped outside, leaving behind the place and the children who had meant so much to him. That weekend, while most of Willow Creek went about its quiet routines, Sam Turner sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment, a pencil clutched tightly in his hand. The kitchen was dim lit by a single bulb humming softly overhead. His mother was asleep in the next room, exhausted after her overnight shift at the hospital. The fridge rattled in the corner, its shelves nearly bare, but Sam's focus was on the lined sheet of paper before him. His handwriting was slow, careful, as he concentrated on each word. "Dear Uncle Dan, the janitor who helped me got fired," he wrote. "He was the only nice person at school. Mom's working 2 jobs, and sometimes I'm just really hungry. I thought you should know." He hesitated for a moment, then added one last line. "I miss Dad." He folded the letter carefully, just the way his father had shown him when mailing things overseas. He placed it in an envelope, pressed it shut with a firm thumb, and used the last of his allowance to stick a stamp in the corner. Early the next morning, Sam walked alone to the mailbox at the corner and slipped the letter inside. Several days later at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, Major Daniel Scott sorted through his mail a mix of official military memos, reports, and supply orders. But when his eyes landed on the familiar childlike handwriting, he paused. Sliding a thumb beneath the envelope flap, he opened it carefully and read. As he read, the usual sounds of the base faded, the distant cadence of marching boots, the hum of vehicles, the clipped commands of training drills. His nephew had never once written to complain since losing his father. Not about missing him, not about struggling at school, not about the empty fridge or the long nights alone. But this had broken through his young, brave silence. Major Scott sat back heavily in his chair, but something else stirred in his mind, something that pulled him back years. Leo Moore. The name had once passed through military halls with quiet respect. Leo wasn't just a janitor. Scott remembered him as the logistics officer who had quietly ensured that fallen soldiers were brought home with dignity. Leo had stayed up through the night to press uniforms, carefully folded flags, polished boots, and handwritten notes for grieving families. He was the man no one saw but whom everyone trusted when it mattered most. And now Scott realized Leo hadn't changed. He was still quietly standing guard, this time for his nephew. And that Scott knew with certainty was something no uniform, no title, and no chain of command could ignore. By dawn the next morning, the Marine base in North Carolina was buzzing with quiet, purposeful energy. Major Daniel Scott stood in front of 3 black SUVs, his jaw, set eyes scanning the men and women gathering around him. Word had spread faster than he could have imagined. What began as a personal mission had turned into something much larger. The moment Major Scott had shared his nephew's letter with his commanding officer, it had rippled through the base like a current. A janitor, a veteran, fired for feeding a child. Not just any child, the son of a fallen soldier, and not just any janitor, Leo Moore, the man who had once handled the most sacred of tasks, bringing their fallen brothers and sisters home with honor. By sunrise, 3 black SUVs rolled out from Camp Lejeune, carrying Marines in full dress uniform. They weren't carrying weapons or gear, just flags, letters, and medals, symbols of respect. But as they crossed into Georgia, something remarkable happened. Through veteran networks, military family chat groups, and social media threads, the story spread like wildfire. By the time the convoy reached the Georgia border, it had doubled in size. Veterans on motorcycles, families in pickup trucks, active duty soldiers on leave, all joined in. Some drove for hours, some met them on the road. They came not to protest, not to threaten, but to stand in quiet, unwavering solidarity. They were coming to honor inside one of the SUVs. Major Scott pulled out an old photograph from his breast pocket, a faded image of a younger Leo Moore standing tall beside a flag-draped casket on an airfield tarmac. The memory hit hard. He remembered Leo's quiet, steadfast presence, the way he worked through the night pressing uniforms and polishing metals, ensuring no fallen soldier was ever disrespected in their final journey home. In the back seat, a young corporal adjusted his collar, glancing at Scott. "Sir, does the school know who they fired?" Scott shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "No, but they're about to—" As the convoy rumbled down the highway, passing small towns and farms, people gathered along the roadsides, waving flags, saluting, holding handmade signs of thanks. The news had reached the local communities, and the message was clear. This wasn't just about Leo or Sam anymore. It was about dignity, about loyalty, and about the truth that some acts of service never end when the uniform comes off. By Monday at sunrise, the parking lot of Willow Creek Elementary had been transformed. Rows of black SUVs and motorcycles lined the front drive like a military procession. Marines in full dress uniform stepped out, their boots hitting the pavement in unison. Medals gleaming in the early morning light. Parents pulling into the lot for morning drop-off froze mid-step, jaws, slack eyes wide as they took in the scene. Children pressed their faces to the windows, their usual morning chatter silenced by the sight of the uniformed men and women gathering with precise discipline. Principal Carol Simmons arrived minutes later, her high heels clicking nervously across the asphalt. Her usual air of polished control faltered as she took in the crowd, her mouth opened then closed. For the first time in years, the woman who always had a plan found herself without words. Major Daniel Scott stepped forward, his dress blues impeccable, a quiet authority radiating from his every movement. In his hand was the letter his nephew had written, carefully folded, the creases now softened from being held so often over the past 2 days. "Ma'am," Scott said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of command. "We understand the rules. We respect order. But some acts of honor don't need a policy manual." With a respectful nod, he turned to the PA system that a young teacher had hurriedly set up. His voice crackled through the speakers, carrying across the schoolyard and into the classrooms. "Students of Willow Creek Elementary," he began, pausing to let the murmurs fade. "My name is Major Daniel Scott, United States Marine Corps. I'm here today because 3 days ago, a man you all know, a man you called Uncle Leo, was fired. Not because he broke a law, not because he caused harm, but because he fed a hungry child. That child happens to be my nephew, Sam Turner." He let the words settle before continuing, his voice now edged with quiet emotion. "What you may not know is that Leo Moore is a veteran. Years ago, when I was a younger Marine, Leo was the man who ensured that our fallen came home with dignity. He worked through the night to press uniforms, to fold flags, to polish metals. He never asked for praise. He never asked for thanks. And last week, without asking anyone's permission, he showed the same care to a little boy sitting alone on a bench." Major Scott looked out over the crowd. Parents wiped their eyes. Teachers stood frozen in doorways. Children listened wide-eyed. He didn't do it for applause. Scott finished softly. He did it because no one gets left behind, not in the field and not in a schoolyard. The very next day, the school district announced that Leo Moore's termination had been reversed. But that wasn't all. Instead of simply reinstating him as a janitor, they offered him a new role, one that no one, including Leo, had seen coming. He was appointed the school's first ever community outreach coordinator, a position created specifically to build programs supporting struggling families, children in need, and veterans in the community. It was a title, sure, but more importantly, it was a recognition of what Leo had been doing all along, quietly watching over those who needed help without waiting for permission. A week later, the school held a small ceremony in the courtyard. The children gathered in a semicircle, their faces bright with excitement. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder, some holding handmade signs. The principal, a noticeably humbled Carol Simmons, stepped forward and unveiled a bronze plaque installed near Sam's old lunch bench. Here it read, "Someone did the right thing. Not because they had to, but because they couldn't look away." Leo stood beside it, his hands folded awkwardly, slightly overwhelmed by the attention. Sam stood close, slipping his small hand into Leo's weathered one. For once, Leo didn't shy away from the applause. Local news outlets quickly picked up the story, broadcasting images of the Marines' arrival, the heartfelt ceremony, and interviews with parents, students, and veterans. But the impact didn't stop at Willow Creek. The story spread across Georgia, then across the country. News anchors marveled at the janitor who sparked a movement. Opinion pieces debated the balance between rules and compassion. Social media lit up with hashtags like Heroes Helping, Heroes and Be Like Leo. Soon other schools began reevaluating their policies. Churches, businesses, and local governments reached out to Willow Creek for guidance, and what began as a small, quiet act of kindness evolved into the Heroes Helping Heroes initiative, a program dedicated to supporting students from military families, funding school meals, and fostering community service projects in schools across the nation. But perhaps the most touching transformation happened at Willow Creek itself. The school that had once been a place of strict rules became a place of open doors. Principal Simmons, once known for her ironclad policies, began hosting monthly listening lunches with parents and students. Teachers started noticing the quiet kids a little more. And every afternoon as the bell rang and the playground filled, children would glance at the bench with the plaque, a silent reminder that sometimes the smallest act can change an entire town. On Veterans Day, the morning sun cast a soft glow over Willow Creek Elementary family students. Teachers and veterans gathered in the school courtyard, the air filled with a rare quiet sense of unity. At the center of it all stood Leo Moore, his silver hair neatly combed, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. Beside him stood Sam Turner, his small hands clutching the edge of the folded American flag they were about to raise together. As the flag slowly climbed the pole, a hush fell over the crowd. Parents who had once rushed through drop-off without a second glance now stood with hands over hearts. Teachers who once focused solely on lesson plans now watched with misty eyes. Even Principal Carol Simmons, once known for her rigid adherence to rules, stood silently at the front. Behind her office door now hung a small sign that read, "Come in with solutions." It was a small change, but one that spoke volumes. For Leo, standing beside Sam, it wasn't about attention or praise. It was about the quiet truth he had learned over the years, both in uniform and out, that service is not just found on a battlefield or in grand gestures. Service lives in the everyday moments, in noticing the child sitting alone, in offering help without expecting thanks, in seeing people not for what they lack, but for what they carry inside. As the flag reached the top of the pole and snapped gently in the breeze, Leo placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. The boy looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes, and for a moment it was as if the weight they both carried had been lightened, if only just a little. Reporters, cameras, and onlookers might remember the Marines, the convoy, and the headlines. But Leo knew the real story wasn't in the spectacle, it was in the lesson left behind. You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. Leo would later tell a group of students gathered around him on the playground. Sometimes service is just noticing someone who needs a hand and reaching out. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Leo watched as parents lingered to chat with teachers, as children ran up to greet veterans, and as Principal Simmons knelt to help a kindergartner tie his shoe. It wasn't just a school that had changed. It was a community reminded perhaps that the most lasting transformations often begin with the simplest, most human acts of kindness. As we reflect on Leo Moore's journey, we're reminded that true service doesn't always wear a uniform or come with medals. In today's fast-moving world, where headlines flash by and people often rush through their days without noticing those around them, Leo's quiet example reminds us of something timeless and deeply American: the power of small acts of kindness. Whether it's sharing a meal, offering a word of encouragement, or simply noticing someone who feels invisible, these gestures can ripple outward in ways we can't predict. In Leo's case, a simple sandwich and a note transformed not just a child's life, but an entire community, and ultimately sparked a national conversation about compassion, honor, and what it truly means to serve. For older adults watching this, you know better than anyone how powerful a quiet helping hand can be. Many of you have been the Leos in your own families and neighborhoods, offering support, guidance, or just a listening ear when it was needed most. And for younger viewers, this story invites us all to look up from our busy lives and ask who around me might need a little help today. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you witnessed or been part of an act of kindness that changed someone's life? What do you think communities can do to support one another better today? Please share your stories in the comments below. We truly want to hear from you. If this story moved, you don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who could use a little inspiration today. Thank you for being part of this incredible journey where we remember that real heroes often walk among us quietly every day.